Have you ever wondered, how on earth did I get stuck in an abusive relationship? Why didn't I see the red flags? And if I did, why was it so difficult to leave? So if you have ever asked those questions, then you are in the right place. So welcome to another episode of our expert interview series for the Rising Beyond community. I'm Sybil Cummin. I'm the creator of Rising Beyond Power and Control. And today I'm really excited to have a really seasoned expert here with us, Shelly Pumphrey. Welcome, Shelly.
Thanks, Sybil. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about Shelly and why I wanted her to be here. So Shelly is a licensed professional counselor, relationship coach, Reiki master, and author. She's got over 27 years of clinical experience, and she's really worked with a diverse group of clients and different problems and issues, but she really specializes in working with trauma, adult attachment, narcissistic abuse, and pathological relationships. She is the founder and clinical director of Trilogy Holistic Mental Health in Denver, Colorado. And she's a clinical director of Strength and Motion Counseling in Boulder, Colorado. She's really passionate about holistic healthcare, and she's recently written a book that I know we're going to hear a little bit about. It's called Insight is 2020. So Shelly, thank you for being here. And we're just going to have a conversation on what you do, what you see, and some tips and things that can help the women that both of us work with.
Awesome. Thank you. One of my favorite topics.
Yeah,
There's so much to learn about it.
I know. And so, when you're thinking about what questions people come to you with, when they're in that state of kind of confusion about why am I feeling this way? What did I get myself into? Mm-hmm. What are some of those questions that you get pretty frequently?
Well, a couple of questions that I often hear from people are, how did I miss the red flags? Or how did I see the red flags, but then somehow I dismiss them or let them go? And people will often come in with a lot of guilt and shame and just confusion over that. And this is really one of the biggest things that I think we have to work with when somebody's been in one of these relationships. If you're feeling confused over that and you're feeling some of that guilt and shame, a good example would be, I never thought I'd be with somebody who would cheat on me. And yet this partner has cheated on me all the time, yet I stay. Why do I do that? And what happens is that's a process of what we call cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. And cognitive dissonance is where we hold two opposing beliefs or values or thoughts in our mind that are in conflict with each other. And what happens with people who are in these relationships is they start to develop a ton of cognitive dissonance, which is actually one of the top symptoms of trauma of these kinds of pathological love relationships. So it's a part of why we start ignoring or dismissing the red flags, because what happens is you get into these kinds of confusing thoughts of, oh, but I love him so much. I think of all these all these great memories we had, but oh my God, he's horrible. He beats me up. He makes me feel horrible about myself. He lies all the time. And I love him so much, and I want to be with him, and I can't imagine not having the holidays with him. Oh my God, I'm scared for my life. I need to leave. It's that constant confusion where you're 1 minute loving, the next minute loathing. That's cognitive dissonance. And that is one of the key trauma symptoms and factors that keep people stuck in these relationships.
That's what I was going to ask is, they're in those two places, and which direction do they go? Right? That picture is painted for them of how, the relationship could be. This is how the relationship is.
Right.
So how do you help kind of navigate that? I really focus on not I don't make choices for my clients. They get to make their choices. How do you help them process those two opposing experiences?
Yeah. Well, one of the primary things that I think is important to realize is that this is trauma. And there are research studies that show when somebody is experiencing cognitive dissonance, that the brain is having the same kinds of reactions as you would with like post-traumatic stress disorder. So what happens is you start to feel confused all the time. You may not have any energy. You feel like you can't concentrate. You can't make decisions. You have no memory. You're not yourself. You're depressed. You're anxious, all the things, right? People start to just walk around in that kind of just dazed and confused state and feeling really lost and unsure of what to do. So I think, you know, back to your question, the most important thing is to realize that this is trauma. And the way we deal with trauma, the best way to deal with trauma is to do trauma treatment that is focused somehow on the body. And that can be, and that really needs to be with a therapist who specializes in trauma treatment and working with narcissistic abuse and pathological love relationships, which maybe we can talk about that in a bit here. But, you know, I think a lot of time, like there's so much information on YouTube and the internet, we can Google narcissistic abuse to death. And I think one of the problems is a lot of people, very well-meaning people, a lot of survivors who are kind of survivors turned experts, go out and they're kind of regurgitating what everybody else is saying about it, but there's not really a lot of trauma-informed information out there. So we take it in kind of on this cognitive level. I can read all these books, I can try these techniques, I can do gray rock, I can go no contact, you know, like all these things. But it's not dealing with the nervous system and the brain and the body, which is where trauma is held and where it needs to be healed. And that's where like dealing with a trauma therapist is really important, because they can help get into those deeper layers and really help resolve some of that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I agree. And there's different, I always think about like, there's not going to be like your one healer, this one healer. Right? Like we're each a drop in the bucket. So for example, my community members, they're doing group work, they're getting support from that realm, but it's not therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's like trauma informed, right? Everyone that is on the team are actually, you know, trained therapists, but there's got to be there's another side to it, is doing therapy that is really integrating that kind of polyvagal nervous system, which we talk about a lot within the community, but we don't do that work. And so it is so helpful to have, right, you have this therapist that can do that trauma work with you. You have support from a group, from other survivors. You're also over here doing the learning piece. Yeah. Which I always think is that first piece of like,
yeah, so important
about what the heck this is.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it is good to think of it in that way. Like it really is a multifaceted approach when you're working on healing. And, you know, usually the first thing that survivors do is, once they start questioning like what is going on, or maybe somebody comes to them out of concern and says, you shouldn't be treated that way, you know, you know, usually they turn to Google or, you know, and start learning, and learning is extremely important. And sometimes we're not in a place where we can access trauma therapy, either because you're in an unsafe situation with your partner and you couldn't, either you don't have access to money or he would find out. So it's, you know, that's like ideal. And at some point you really need that, but anything you can get is good. And first of all, just educating yourself just to get some sanity, like to start realizing like, is this gaslighting? Am I crazy? You know, when you start to have those questions about yourself and your reality, take it from wherever you can get it, especially other survivors too. I think it's really important to have that community of supports where you can see that this kind of behavior is outrageous and you need some reality checks all the time.
It's not normal.
Yeah.
It's right. It's different. And I think, what I see is like when you first learn that term gaslighting, if there was enough, like, it has to be more than you, like you're not the only one for them to create a word, for them to create language around it.
That's a good point.
Right? Like, wow, this is like everywhere. That must mean it's not just me that's experiencing this. And so what I'm interested about, so we've talked that I work with, in my practice, I work with a pretty high acuity clientele, which some survivors shy away from a little bit because the term domestic violence seems really scary and they don't feel like they fit. Yeah. So what I'm interested in your work is the term, so narcissistic abuse, it's a much more used term now, like people are understanding that, but also pathological relationships and kind of if there's a difference in what those look like. And maybe even if the work afterwards is different.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. So if you look at like pathological love relationships is really the clinical term that some of the leading researchers in this field of working with these relationships are encouraging us to use. Sandra Brown is one of them. She wrote a book called How to Spot a Dangerous Man and Women Who Love Psychopaths. And she's done a ton of research in this area. So, she uses this, that's where that term comes from, pathological love relationships. And it's the thing that I like about the word is that it's kind of all encompassing. It includes narcissistic abuse. Mm-hmm. But the reality is when you're dealing with someone who is a narcissist or narcissistic, we have when you look at personality disorders in general, typically there's what we call these cluster B symptoms where somebody with a personality disorder will usually have traits of the same or the personality disorders in this cluster. So they might have some traits of antisocial where they think they're above the law and they lack a conscience, or they could be a little borderline and have more issues with relationships and attachments. So, or they're on the narcissistic side. So essentially, pathological love relationships is a broad term that sums up any relationship with somebody who has some kind of quote unquote pathology or a personality disorder or traits of it. And because of that, there will be inevitable harm done to the person in that relationship. So that's kind of where that comes from. And yeah, I think most of us say narcissistic abuse because that's what everybody talks about and knows.
Kids term. Kids term right now.
Right. So yeah, that's where that comes from.
Yeah. And what I'm, as I'm hearing it, I actually think that it's more accessible. So it, if it is scary, so I always say, domestic violence is not always narcissistic abuse, but narcissistic abuse is always domestic violence. But people shy away from the term intimate partner violence or domestic violence because it feels just really scary. But I'm even thinking going further that pathological love relationships feels more accessible to people in general. They may not have this like vision of what domestic violence looks like, right? Like we have this vision of what that looks like.
Yeah.
These other terms, which is why I think that, narcissistic abuse and now, pathological love relationships it's going to feel better.
Yeah.
Feel better to own.
I agree. Because I think people do have this, we've watched so many movies of, the quote unquote battered woman who, leaves with her 2 kids and nothing in the middle of the night to escape abuse and ends up in a battered women's shelter. And that's what we equate with domestic violence. And yes, that happens. That is one aspect of domestic violence, but it can be narcissistic abuse where you never have a finger laid on you. Maybe you never have to escape in the middle of the night, but you are tortured psychologically and emotionally for decades, years, months, whatever it may be. And that, yeah, it is a form of domestic violence, and we need to recognize that. But I think pathological love relationships is a little more encompassing of all of the different ways that our relationships can cause harm.
Yeah, and I think that that's the piece I really like about maybe the definition is this relationship is causing harm. It doesn't mean that you got punched in the face.
Right.
The relationship can be causing harm in all these different ways, which is, you know, what I would love for like the general system and community to learn and to hear that it's not, you know, solely the physical abuse, solely the sexual abuse. There's all these other things that encompass that. And from that healing perspective, that is also really helpful to identify those things. So when you are thinking about maybe conceptualizing kind of those first steps of healing, what would you say are, you know, some of those first steps, first stages, however you see it, of healing from a pathological love relationship, narcissistic abuse?
Well, I always like to say, like, you can't get very far if you don't have awareness. So starting to get awareness is key. And I think this is so true for people in these relationships, because usually, you know, depending on how much you've been abused or how long you've been in this situation, you can have extreme confusion and self-doubt. And, you know, because of the gaslighting and manipulation that occurs, you just don't even know. You know, you truly believe it's me. I'm the crazy one. You know, that's the hallmark of gaslighting. So trying to get awareness is the first step. And if that means you Google narcissistic abuse and you Google signs of gaslighting 10 times a day just to have a sanity check, great. Do what you can. Talk to, you know, I say this, like, take this advice with a grain of salt, but I think talking to somebody else, a friend or a family member, is helpful. But there are so many people who give horrible advice when it comes to our relationships. You know, it's all based on, there's so many of us who have a lack of knowledge of these relationships, even in the professional community, let alone just anybody. But, you know, you get things like, oh, marriage is hard, or, you know, it's that idea, death till death do us part, or maybe you should just, don't break up, don't get a divorce, it's so hard on them. And, you know, there's a lot of like well-intentioned advice, but be very cautious of who you talk to. And if you talk to somebody and you leave that conversation feeling worse or doubting yourself more, then it's probably a sign that you shouldn't be talking to them about it. So that's, you know, I think in general, those are two places to start. And one of the other things that I think is important, and this is something that I talk about a lot in my book, is learning to listen to ourselves, because I see it as we have two types of red flags. We have external red flags, and that's where you can go read a book and Google and learn everything you can to see if this person is narcissistic or pathological. But we have internal red flags, and those are what are going to tell us everything we need to know. That's like where we start to tune into our bodies and listen to, am I always feeling stressed? Have I gained weight? Am I not sleeping? Is my stomach upset all the time? Am I feeling anxious? There are all these physical symptoms that come in our bodies when we're experiencing trauma that many of us, or maybe most of us, don't even realize are connected to stress and trauma. But it is completely connected, and our bodies are like, hello, over here, red flag, warning, warning. And another thing to think of is you might be having those symptoms, or maybe you're totally disconnected because you're in a trauma state. You know, either we're very hyper tuned into everything, or we're totally checked out. which is just a defensive, protective response. So that's like skimming the surface of what that's like. But I think, it's just something to think of is my body, is my intuition, is there something inside of me that says something doesn't feel right here, even if you can't put your finger on it.
Yeah. And those, when I am asked that question, like, why didn't I see the red flags? Or I did see the red flags and I pushed that way down. I pushed that like gut voice.
Yes.
I silenced that voice because I was able to make excuses for the behavior. And so it's like refinding that voice. But what I like about what you shared is some of it you can look at even if you can't hear your voice yet, because have I gained weight? Do I have stomach discomfort a lot? Do I have tension headaches? How am I holding my body? How rigid am I all the time? How is my executive functioning? So my community knows that I have some real executive functioning concerns and I'm all over the place a lot of times. So if that's not you, but now you're all over the place and you have lost your phone for like the 30th time that day, which is not new for me. That's not weird for me. That's me every day. But if that's a new behavior, you don't even have to hear your gut yet.
Right.
There are these things that
that's
are just
a red flag. Right.
Indicators of it until you can learn to trust your gut. So I really like that. So you shared a little bit about the book. So I'm interested, why did you decide, like, I'm going to write this book?
Great question. So it was personal and professional. On the professional side, I have worked with domestic violence, pathological love relationships, survivors of them, my entire career. My very first internship was working in a battered women's shelter, and it's always been a passion of mine. And it's also personal because I have been a victim of narcissistic abuse more than once. And I had a lot of shame about it. As a therapist, I thought, oh my God, I specialize in working with this. How did I miss this? How did I let this go? How did I ignore the red flags? And it just devastated me when it happened more than once, even that it happened the first time. And I really wanted to understand how could that be true for me? If that's true for me, then how easy is it for other people who don't know anything about narcissism, And so that was part of writing the book. Was some of it was like, I need to dig into this and learn for myself, but I am just super passionate about using my story to help other people heal and to just help people avoid this kind of devastation and heartbreak in their lives. So that's where it came from. And I am a trauma therapist through and through, and just really wanted a book that helped people understand in a simple to understand way what trauma does to you, what it feels like in your body, and how to recognize, like, you don't have to be an expert in knowing what trauma is, but if you feel these kinds of things, it probably means something's wrong. Like, that's a red flag to pay attention to. Maybe you don't know if your person's a narcissist or not. It doesn't matter. It just matters, like, am I listening to my body and can I honor that? So yeah, that's kind of where this all came from.
Yeah. And I like that it is the easy to read. I do not like presenting clients with books where I'm like having to give all these caveats of like, hey, we're gonna have to bring that in. I'm gonna have to do a full flow chart for you to explain your nervous system. And right, like they don't
right.
It's really overwhelming when you're already overwhelmed.
Right. Yeah, can't do it. Like you said, executive functioning is not on board when we are suffering from trauma. And so it needs to be easy and understandable.
Yep. In chunks that we can understand, see how it relates to us, in that moment, and in, past experience, looking back, looking forward. What I do appreciate in your vulnerability of sharing your experience is because the hopelessness that a lot of my clients at my practice and clients within the community feel when they have had more than one abusive relationship. Like, how on earth, I felt so good, like I got out of this one and I'm in another one. Do you see that they typically look different? The two relationships look different?
Well, that is a good point. It can. That was certainly what happened to me. And sometimes, like for my experience, I had a grandiose narcissist and I was just in a bad place. And I don't know, that happened. But then a covert narcissist came along, and that was extremely difficult to identify and really threw me for a loop. So I think, there's different ways that narcissism can look. And then there are also, narcissism is on a spectrum. There are people who might have some narcissism or full-blown narcissism that you're going to see within a couple of dates, so I think there can be differing experiences, but, one thing that I want to share that most people are not aware of is, a lot of people think that they're codependent. Like, that's some of the stuff that we get, like you're codependent, or you grew up in a home with trauma or childhood abuse, and so you got to work on that. Well, that could very well be true. People who come from a background of trauma, or they had parents who were narcissists, typically codependency is some of the patterning, or what I call a fawning trauma response, where you do a lot of people pleasing, which is really codependency. I won't go into that, but there's a whole other aspect that happens for women that make them vulnerable that nobody really knows about or talks about. It's about personality. And this is where therapists get this wrong, and where a lot of the common knowledge out on the internet goes wrong too. There was a study done by Sandra Brown and Purdue University that showed that 63% of the women in this study actually had personality traits of what we call agreeableness and conscientiousness that made them vulnerable to this abuse. And they actually did not have significant backgrounds of trauma or codependent or characteristics of codependency. And what happens is, with conscientiousness and agreeableness, our personality traits are hardwired into us. Our personality does not change. So if you're trying to tell somebody who have these traits, deal with it from the lens of you're codependent, just try to heal these things, you don't really heal personality. You learn how to manage your personality traits. That's what you do. And so people that are agreeable and conscientious typically have a high degree of loyalty to relationships. They're very flexible. They are cooperative. They're very tolerant of really horrible behaviors. They're very compassionate. They're empathic. They're these nice, easygoing people who are very dedicated, loyal. I'm gonna follow this relationship out, and I'm gonna fix it. I'm gonna figure it out. That's who they are. And that is why people with those traits start overlooking the red flags. And I used to have a joke, and I hate to even say this, but I'm gonna say it out of vulnerability, but because I've just worked with so much trauma in my career, I always used to say I could love a serial killer. And the truth is, I can have compassion for anybody, because that's the work that I do. That's who I am. And that ended up being an Achilles heel for me in my relationships. Not that I love the serial killer, to my knowledge, I hope, but some narcissists, you just put up with it. And I met a ton of therapists who have had multiple narcissistic relationships, or teachers or nurses, people who tend to have these personality traits. So it's something that's really important for women to know, if it's personality or trauma and codependency based. And some people have both.
Yeah. And what I see really often is the hook, right? The getting you back is based in your empathy. And so a lot of my clients, that is the hook, like over and over and over. I just, in session, I just let them know, like, you are worried that no one is going to care for this person. No one is going to have empathy for this person. I am telling you that I am a therapist. I understand why they are the way they are. And I can hold empathy for your partner, for your ex-partner, so that you don't have to right now, because you can't right now because it's harmful to you. And sometimes just that, like knowing that there's someone, I do understand where that abusive person is coming from, and can't hold some compassion for that. Sometimes just that, like giving permission to no longer have empathy for those behaviors, you know, and accept that.
Absolutely.
Really, really meaningful.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
And I work with men as well. And I work with non-binary as well, because it's domestic not discriminate. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. It doesn't. Doesn't matter.
So I really appreciate that. So I am going to be putting the link to Insight is 2020 in, it's like down here, but not right now because we're in the interview, but it will be down there if you're watching the interview. So yeah, is there any kind of ending thoughts, words that you would like? So all the women watching this, they're women, that's the community. Any words of wisdom or ending thoughts that you would like for them to have?
You know, I think the biggest thing that just popped up into my head is trust yourself to protect yourself. You know, and I know that it is so hard to trust yourself when you are dealing with this abuse, but if you're questioning it, trust yourself. We always know the truth. We just have lots of things that go on in our minds that hide us from it or protect us from it. But yeah, trust yourself.
Yeah, and learn to listen, learn to put the people around you that are gonna support that effort of listening to yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. And to know that you can get through it and there is life on the other side. I am living proof of that. And I've done it more than I'd like to say. And you can get through it. You really can.
Yeah. And that, you know, when you're looking at it as like the marathon for a lot of our clients and women, it is a marathon, but hearing from survivors who are, you know, have healed from that aftermath of is such an important just message to be out there, that there is hope of healing from this. Well, Shelly, thank you so much. Again, we will have all the information of how to get in touch with you and how to find your book, The Rising Beyond Community. We really appreciate experts, because the way I say something may not resonate. And so having all of these different thoughts and ideas coming together to support each other and support healing is just so important to this community. So again, I thank you. And community members, thank you so much for being a part of such a strong community, and be looking for some other expert and survivor interviews.